Welcome to the Free Speech Nation podcast with me, Andrew Doyle. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome my guest, Jason Miller. Jason is the CEO of the new social media platform Gettr, and he was also a senior advisor on the Trump 2020 campaign. In this conversation, we spoke about all sorts of things. We spoke about his new platform, Gettr. We spoke about the relationship between social media and the government. We spoke about free speech and also touched on Donald Trump and whether he'll run again, and to what degree social media will play a role in that. I'm sure you can guess the answer. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I did. Thank you very much for joining me today, Jason. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a little bit about you. I think a lot of the people listening to the podcast will be interested in your background and how you got to where you are today. Perhaps you could fill us in on that.
Absolutely. Well, long background in campaign politics in the United States. Probably most memorably, 2016, I was the lead spokesperson as well as the senior communications advisor for President Donald Trump. This was, of course, in his first campaign, and worked for the president, helped him score the historic win. Did not go into the White House, went into private business consulting, and also was a political commentator on CNN, among other places, and then was brought back to be the senior advisor for President Trump's 2020 run, and then stayed with him in the following when he left the presidency, and helped to run his impeachment defense effort the second go around. They tried to impeach him twice. And then in July of this year, I formally launched Gettr, which has become the fastest growing social media platform in history. We're now up over 3 million users just since July. Fastest ever to 1 million, fastest ever to 2 million, fastest ever to 3 million. So it's pretty exciting.
So in terms of setting up a social media platform like this, given your background, do people accuse you of setting up something which is specifically politically partisan? Is that something that is an inevitable accusation that's going to come through?
Well, people are always going to go and raise questions about what angle you're coming from, or is there a particular bias? I don't hide for any second that I'm a conservative Republican, that I'm a Trump supporter, but I think it's important that we have a free speech platform that's available to everybody. Initially, a lot of the passion in the free speech movement is in the center-right space. But that's not historically where much of the free speech passion has been. So as we start to see with Mr. Agrawal, the new Twitter CEO, I think there'll be new restrictions, more censorship with big tech, not even just with Twitter, but with Facebook, Instagram, all sorts of other platforms. I think we're going to start to see more and more people look for a free speech alternative. And one of the exciting things, I think one of the most dynamic things about the Gettr platform this early on is the fact that only about 37% of the customer base is from the United States. We've really grown globally. And so just in the same way that people in the UK, for example, don't wake up and say, are we Republicans or are we Democrats? People in Brazil don't wake up and say, are we Tories or are we Labor? People have different perspectives from all around the world. In fact, our top 3 countries by user growth are the United States, Brazil, and Japan. A lot of diversity there. And I'm really proud of some of the what I would say is not traditionally political folks who joined our platform, such as Boston Celtics center Enes Kanter Freedom, who's made a lot of noise criticizing President Xi, President Erdogan, even LeBron James, Gina Carano, the actress from The Mandalorian. We have several UFC fighters, former New York Mets and Phillies All-Star Lenny Dykstra. So a lot of exciting people who don't necessarily come from the world of politics, but believe in free speech.
I think you raise a number of interesting points there, in particular when you talk about this idea that the centre-right seems to be the space where people are calling for more free speech. Now, when I was a young person, it was very much more voices from the left that were calling for that. Now it seems that voices from the left are more hostile to free speech. So when a new platform emerges, it's inevitably tarred and labelled as one thing or the other. How do you think we've got to this point where free speech as a concept it can be so readily dismissed as a right-wing talking point, as I see that all the time?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I think a lot of it is just simply that the traditional structure, whether that be big tech, whether that be the mainstream media, whether it be some of the global elite, to speak in a very general phrase, have been unable to control the political forces they've seen around them. Again, not just exclusive to the United States. Look at Brexit, for example, the way that snuck up and surprised many in the the UK media, many of the elites in UK who obviously were very upset with that outcome. Take a look at the way that President Bolsonaro won in Brazil. He certainly snuck up on the elites in big tech and big media. And of course, President Trump, really President Trump's superpower, not just in 2016, even going into 2020, but it was greatly inhibited in 2020. His superpower has always been able to bypass the mainstream media, to go and talk directly to people without that filter that typically a politician would have to go through. He snuck up on people in 2016, but they were ready for him, and he didn't sneak up on them in 2020. They changed the rules of the game in the middle of it. They started to censor and shadow ban, and ultimately, after January 6th, deplatforming President Trump altogether. And I think that much of it, you could say, has been a TDS, a Trump derangement syndrome, where it's continued to push people into respective corners, but not exclusively, as we've seen from a number of countries around the world. But taking a step back for a moment, I think this is really concerning, this broader trend of the polarization and big tech and big media saying, we're going to give you your free speech rights, but only if we agree with what you're saying. I think that's the wrong direction to go. I think everybody needs free speech. In fact, one of the big efforts we're making a push with, or try to get the Bernie Sanders type supporters, people who are a little more left of center, but are also a little more distrustful of the government, who do believe in that inherent right. And I think that as a democracy, or democracies, obviously the US and UK and Brazil and Japan, other countries being separate, it really hinges on that ability for self-expression and political thought. And as soon as we lose that, we become a totalitarian state.
So your view with Gettr is very much that you're not going to emulate what Twitter does, but from a right-wing perspective, because Twitter, of course, as you point out, firstly, I mean, deplatforming the president is quite an astonishing thing for a company to do, and obviously partisan. But then in addition to that, you've got them hiding the New York Post article on Hunter Biden and preventing people from sharing. So into what we might call political or electoral intervention going on there. So you would say that with Gettr, you're not going to do that against leftists. That's not the way you're going to run this.
No, not at all. In fact, I'll frequently repost people saying less than favorable things about me just to show that, hey, we'll have Democrats and people on here. I'll usually make a snide comment such as, I think I found Hunter Biden's burner account, or Hillary, is this you? But we're not going to do that. As long as you play within the boundaries. Obviously, we don't allow people suggesting unlawful activities or people threatening bodily harm, just in the same way that you can't walk into a pub and threaten someone physically and not expect there to be a repercussion. You can't go and someone physically on the Gettr platform, and we're not going to put up with any racial or religious epithets. I don't think that's political free speech. I think that's going into a different road. But when it comes to your right to express yourself politically, even if I am at the polar opposite of what I think, and or other people on the team, we think you're absolutely crazy and that's not the direction that we believe in, you're expressing your political thought, you're welcome to come and do it here. And in fact, we invite you. All that we ask is that if you support free speech and you oppose cancel culture, we think you'd be a perfect fit for Gettr.
And you will find, I think, that there will be lots of people from the left who are joining you in that. I mean, around the time of the Trump's election, I remember I was contacted by a number of Bernie Sanders supporters who had actually voted Trump ultimately. And I think it's tied to these culture wars, is that people find themselves politically homeless. We've had the same in the UK. The last election saw a landslide for the Conservative government, and you saw traditional Labour left-wing voters voting for the other side, which is a massive, massive shift. And one of the reasons is they feel like the left has abandoned them, that it's not really authentically left wing anymore. I mean, you mentioned Brexit. Well, the idea that the left suddenly comes out in force in favor of the EU, a massive pro-corporate trading bloc that has capitalism built into its constitution, it feels actually incoherent to be an EU supporter as a traditional left-wing person. So this leaves people completely alienated. I mean, is it maybe the case that because of the culture war, because of these free speech issues that you're addressing, actually left and right doesn't really mean anything anymore?
Yeah, and you're starting to, I think the whole traditional definition of left and right has changed. I think whether it be in the UK or in the US, I don't want to speak more broadly around the world, but it's very much that, ironically, you can make the case that the Tories or the Conservatives are more in favor of the working class people than the party that's named the Labour Party. Mm-hmm. Same thing in the United States, where the parties have really realigned to where the Republicans are really the party of the working class. Democrats are the party that, with the exception of specific, say, racial or whether it be racial or gender or some different identification politics that are carved out, it's largely the party of the ivory tower, college educated, global elite type class. And so it's rearranged, it's changed a lot. I think a lot of that has to do domestically with President Trump, but obviously, as we saw with Brexit, those are kind of the changing winds globally.
Can I ask you specifically about setting up Gettr and the problems that you might face? And I'm thinking specifically here about Parler, for instance, and the way in which once Parler was set up as an alternative to Twitter, the major social media tech giants collaborated, as far as I can see, to eliminate it, to prevent it from succeeding. Do you sense that you will have any kind of difficulties of those kinds as Gettr continues to grow?
Great question. I think that the approach that we've taken has been much different. We've had a robust and proactive moderation policy since day one. And I do get heat from that from some folks saying, well, wait a minute, how can you have a robust and proactive moderation policy and still be the free speech platform? And that's simple, because you do have to have some boundaries, some standards. You can't have people being doxxed. You can't have people putting out and threatening individuals or suggesting illegal activity or sedition or things like that. The problem with Parler is that it had zero moderation, and there's a difference. When you talk with some of the big tech partners or people that you might have to work with in some capacity, as long as you have a moderation platform and you're proactively addressing things, and you do have terms of service that are abided by, we use both an AI system and also human moderators. So it's a two-pronged approach to go and deal with it. Then you can work well together. They might not like your political backing, but the fact of the matter is that we do moderate the platform. Parler's problem is they literally had no moderation. They had what they call a community approach. Here's the problem. When you become a successful free speech platform, you get attacked by the CCP, you get attacked by ISIS, you get attacked by the Russians, you get attacked by left-wing bots and trolls. There are people who flood your platform or attempt to flood your platform with so much material simply to go and try to say, well, look at all this bad material that's on the platform. You need a bigger set of hands to help than just the quote unquote community standards or community policing. That's not enough of a defense.
That's really interesting, because I think when Gab originated as well, and of course this was not set up as a whatever you want to far-right platform, but of course because they had a complete free speech policy, inevitably far-right accounts that wouldn't have been acceptable on Twitter migrated there. And then, of course, the left-wing activists and publications could point at it and say, look at these accounts. This means it's a far-right platform. So you're trying to find a way to avoid that kind of scenario whilst upholding free speech. It's quite a difficult balance, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, some people would come back and say, well, if you're moderating it, it's always open to exploitation in the future. It's always possible that your moderators might allow their political bias to come into the process. And whenever that happens, of course, that might run the risk of discrediting the principles of the site. Is that something you're ever concerned about?
Of course, and that's something we pay very close attention to. All moderators who join the team have to go through pretty extensive training. We also do extensive background checks. And I think also leadership starts from the top down. And you can see how active I am in engaging with Gettr users on a very frequent basis. I think the customer base, the platform, people know that I'm actively engaged. And so I see what's happening on the platform. And users will flag if they think that something was unfairly tagged or they want a better explanation. That's something that I personally will go and address with our customer support team, as well as our moderation teams, to make sure that's happening. But again, what people want, people who are being sent off to Twitter jail or put in digital jail with Facebook and things like that, it's not because they're trafficking in illegal activity. It's not because they're going in and saying that they want to cause sedition or they want to they're hurling racist or religious epithets or those types of things. The people who are being sentenced to digital jail predominantly are people who are expressing their political opinions. That's what we're always going to make sure that we defend here at Gettr. So, for example, when we saw the recent warning labels starting to pop up with Google and YouTube around climate change, There are a lot of people who have varying opinions on climate change. I don't think the science has decided anything completely definitive. I think there are lots of room for interpretation on things, but that should be a debate that is had. I think with regard to COVID, keep in mind people were sentenced to digital jail for saying things as outrageous as the virus originated from a lab in Wuhan. Well, spoiler alert, that effectively became true. Even as we saw big tech go and put the clamp down and say you can't share or say anything about Hunter Biden's laptop, as you referenced earlier. And guess what? That was not Russian disinformation. That was completely true. And so there has to be room for debate. There has to be room for political opinions to be shared. That's where the hunger is. And I think that's the mark that I think a lot of these folks have missed, is that this isn't about half nude pictures of Madonna, which, by the way, I think we can probably agree. I have not seen them, just to be clear for anyone who's watching. I've not seen them. I don't want to see Madonna half nude, fully nude. I don't even want to see Madonna at all. But this is not about Madonna having some part of her body exposed or not exposed and what's appropriate. This is about people determining their own self-destiny, their self-expression, their political beliefs in a very turbulent time in society.
I mean, you mentioned the idea of the Wuhan lab leak theory, which now, of course, even the Biden administration are looking into and are suggesting might be the case. But at one point, accounts were being banned for making that suggestion. They were being dismissed as racist, all the rest of it. And similarly, with any kind of people questioning the consensus around COVID, and of course that is something, it's a new virus that various experts disagree on this. And you, as a social media platform, of course, I suppose it's not really your job to become experts in epidemiology and to determine what information is allowed and what information is not allowed. But then to take it to even further extremes, when people are wrong about history, for instance, when people deny the Holocaust, when people do that kind of thing, do they have the right to do that?
Well, again, it's tough to do in a generalization type way. You have to see the post by post. We do have pretty definitive terms of service. So going to your first example there with regard to, there are a lot of people who talk about different theories on how best to treat COVID. I know, obviously, it's not just people or your traditional folks viewed as right wing. Take a look at Joe Rogan, who obviously, when talking to ivermectin, as far as something that he took after contracting COVID, there are different debates and theories about what best works with regard to COVID. And by the way, I'm old enough to remember that once we were told, if you get vaccinated, then you're going to be fine. You're going to never have to worry about this. Now we're seeing even the news out of the UK this morning with 100 million more doses being ordered, and people saying get your fourth jab. That we might have to get a double-sided stamp card to go and show all the jabs that people have gotten on the trend that this is going. But there should be some room for debate. We do have specific policies regarding self-harm. So say, for example, if somebody were to post something that's just the smartest thing to, somewhere to post the smartest thing to do if you contract COVID is go and cut off your arm. Okay, obviously that is something that's pretty clearly suggesting self-harm. And obviously we're going to take a look at those on a case-by-case basis. But also when you talk about historical things, I think there's, don't want to go into any specific details because obviously you got to see the what the post might look like. But there's a difference between somebody being wrong or somebody being harmful or hateful as it pertains to trying to throw a religious or racial epithet. So we've got to see it on a case-by-case basis. But people are going to get takes wrong. People are going to be somewhat inaccurate with their details. That's not our job to come in and police. Oh, actually, it was this percentage of a change versus that percentage of a change when it comes to a climate change debate or something of that nature. But we are our goal is to make sure that we have hands off as much as possible. But when it gets into a violation of our terms of service, we'll take action.
Well, the reason I mentioned the Holocaust denial example is because it's an extreme example, and when people make these claims, often obviously it is informed by a deep-seated prejudice or an anti-Semitic perspective. But what I think is that, for instance, if you take the historian David Irving, whose facts and figures did not add up, and the best way that he was his views were discredited were by other historians. In other words, people engaging with what he said, exposing how it was wrong, rather than locking him up in a prison, which is what actually happened, which then, of course, gave him a kind of martyr status, and people started to think, well, maybe there's something in it. So, my view on this is, even if it's a deplorable, repugnant misrepresentation of history for personal discriminatory reasons, perhaps the best way to expose that is to allow them to say it, but then critique, ridicule, whatever. That's my view on that. Do you think that's right, or are there limits?
So I think there I'd take a little bit different perspective. I think that there are limits. I think that where you have to watch it closely and why it's tough to do just necessarily. I'd have to see a particular post. Of course, the Holocaust happened. It was one of the most horrific things that's happened in human civilization, and it's something that we should educate and make sure that never happens and that's never allowed to be forgotten. That's why we always see the hashtag never forget. Many people referencing back to that. I think we have to make sure that we stay vigilant to that cause. But I think that also just in broader terms, you got to see on a post by post basis. I personally have never seen anything of the sort on Gettr. I imagine you might have to go to Gab or some of the other platforms to see a little bit more of that. But I've never seen anything of the sort on Gettr. Obviously, something gets into an anti-Semitic type trope, then that's something that would be removed from the platform. But again, there's a difference between somebody getting something wrong and being hurtful and harmful and anti-Semitic. And so I'd have to see on a post by post basis. But just to be clear, the Holocaust absolutely did happen. It's terrible.
Yes, I mean, I don't think any sane adult would disagree with that point of view. But then what about the question of abuse online? So, for instance, when I'm on Twitter or something, I get abuse every day from strangers who don't know me. My view is I don't want them banned from the platform. I want to, as a user, take matters into my own hands and just block them. I want to have that power to decide who I listen to. That's part of my freedom as well. And I would be a bit nervous, actually, and I don't like it when Twitter nukes those accounts that have been abusive towards me, because I think they are entitled to do that under their free speech rights, but I'm under no obligation to listen. And so that's what the block feature does. Ironically, I think the block feature on Twitter is the feature that is meant to preserve free speech and free expression, actually. Does that make sense?
It does. I do think that again, there is a difference between somebody saying you're an idiot or you're wrong. Hey, I even get it sometimes on my own platform. So I get it a lot on Twitter, a little bit less on Gettr, but I get a lot on Twitter. But there's a difference between saying you're an idiot or you're wrong, that type of thing, versus saying I'm going to come over to your house and hurt you. And right. There's everything in between is everything in between. And that's where it has to be looked at. And that's why it's tough to do really kind of the overgeneralization, because the abuse, different people could interpret abuse in different ways. Some people, if they're very much a snowflake, could say any criticism in the slightest bit is abuse. And certainly I see that on Twitter all the time. Yeah. Usually people who are big into identity politics, like, oh my gosh, you criticized me in some way, I'm going to scream bloody murder and say that this is clearly, something that's, based on race or religion or, gender identification or something of that nature. But it might simply say somebody saying that they disagree with them. But if it's when I look at abuse, is this something where they're specifically trying to generate harm to somebody? And I think that's different from just a disagreement online. And so we watch that. We do track that. If somebody feels that they're being abused, they can certainly report it. We also have users who can report that as well. And we take a look at those on a case-by-case basis.
And can I ask another question about the details of this in terms of satire and parody? And, I have a personal interest in this, of course, because I have a satirical persona account on Twitter. And there are often overtures to suggest that those sorts of accounts, anonymous accounts, should be banned, should be removed. But of course, there's a lot of mileage in satire and creating these false personas that can expose things in society that people perceive to be wrong. But they're also often open to misinterpretation because, of course, if you have a satirical account, it might be saying misinformation, fake things, but because it's mocking the kind of people who do that, right? So it takes a sort of level beyond just reading it at face value. You need to understand what the writer is doing there. Will there be any room for that kind of thing on your platform? Will those distinctions be made?
Well, of course, there's room for satire, and where that issue most frequently comes up. So, for example, remember in the early days of Twitter, there were always the not somebody accounts. Yeah. not Boris Johnson, not Donald Trump, and people do the opposite. There's room for parody and things like that. You just need to clearly label that it's a parody or satire account. So, for example, if somebody were to get on there and say, I am Donald Trump, or I'm Nigel Farage, or I'm Priti Patel, or something of that nature, and you're falsely identifying yourself as that person, then that would not be permitted. If you were to get on there and essentially say that you're not Priti Patel, or not Boris Johnson, or not Nigel Farage, and it was a satire account, then of course that would be permitted. And so I do think that even as you look through the satire, I think that we have pretty sophisticated moderators, and they're able to go through that. And again, there's a big difference between satire and parody, or identity theft or identity impersonation. Yeah. And I think that as long as the distinctions are clearly made for who's kind of, what's behind it. But again, they can be anonymous accounts in the fact that you don't have to go put your name on it. I think there needs to be room for some of that independent thought. But again, the only place where we really kind of come in and draw the line is when you're pretending to be somebody that you're not. And I think that gets into a little bit dangerous. That gets into identity theft by another name. And so we do safeguard for that.
What if you're inventing a character who doesn't exist? There's not a parody. You're not parodying any particular person. You're inventing a whole new individual. Or does that cross the line into issues with anonymity?
We have certain KYC, know your customer dynamics. So we know that when you sign up, either you have your account, and then you either have an email or a cell phone number, so know how to contact you or get in touch or follow up on different things. But if you want to create an anonymous account, that's certainly your right to do so, as long as you abide by the terms of service.
So that it's interesting that you continually come back to the terms of service, because I think this is one area where Twitter in particular has failed spectacularly, insofar as the terms of service are very, very vague, open to endless reinterpretation, and they keep changing. And often when people have their accounts banned on Twitter, there is no appeals process. So I've been suspended from Twitter before, and it's a very frustrating process, because you contact them and you get an automated response simply reiterating the original point, which is you've broken the terms of service. And when you say, what have I done? Why? Give me an example. They come back with another email saying you've broken the terms of service. It's Kafkaesque. In other words, you've committed a crime, but they won't tell you what the crime is. And this is something that happens again and again. And often people do speculate, myself included, that the terms of service are deliberately vague in order to justify them deplatforming people they just don't happen to agree with, because they can just choose arbitrarily. Do you have a more clarity in your terms in terms of what's acceptable and what's not?
Yes, we do have essentially a dozen or so points that are very specific to what's allowed, what's not allowed with regard within those terms of service. So I do think that it is pretty clear. I think in some of the overall terms of service, a lot of times that's say for liability purposes, even though there's Section 230 here in the U.S. I think that a lot of times they're written by lawyers, right? And so they're done in a way to make sure that it protects the platform, it protects the people running it and the investors and such. But with what we try to do here, and we do have an appeals process, I will admit that it's still evolving. It's still not quite as good as it should be. We're continually striving to make sure that we have better communication with people so they know. I think you're right, that it's rather infuriating for people to say if they were to get suspended or something of that nature and not have a clear knowing of why that happened. I don't think that's right. And so we're working to continually improve that from our end. But I think we're getting better.
Because one of the groups that are continually kicked off Twitter are what you'd call gender critical feminists, traditionally very left wing feminist people who who say openly online, well, no human being has ever changed sex. They will say there is such thing as biological sex differences. These are not just opinions, but scientific facts. But they will be deplatformed for that. So do you have any policy on that area? Because that's going to be somewhere, I think, where a lot of people are getting very nervous about social media intervention and social media platforms attempting to propagate an untruth and to prevent people from speaking the truth.
Well, I think that, I would say that, especially with the large component of the customer base at the moment being center right. We'll see some commentary of people saying that you're either born a man or you're born a woman. Obviously, you can have your very clear opinions on gender identification and such, but there's a difference between that and, say, somebody coming in and using slurs to attack people who are transgender, for example. I think that's where we would draw the line and say that inappropriate. And so people are going to clearly have their beliefs. I mean, I personally think that you're born a man or a woman, and that's what you that's what you are. I realize that there are other people out there who disagree with that, and so obviously we can have that debate all day long. But when you get in and start throwing slurs at people, and then it becomes more of a harmful, uninviting environment, then I think that that's inappropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone would have an objection to social media platforms if they clearly state, once you start throwing slurs at people, once you start being abusive or harassing people, this platform's not for you. We don't accept that. If it's clearly stated, then, you know, that's not a free speech issue because you've signed up to a contract, etc. But with groups like Twitter who claim to be about free speech, and they routinely ban accounts that are not in any way abusive, but are merely stating these scientific facts. And certainly not being abusive to transgender people at all, but they'll still kick them off, you know?
Yeah, and that's something where, just to go in here, that regardless of which side of that debate that you're on, I think our goal, when we look at it, the lens that we always think, kind of the golden rule, the message that's taped above the door, so to speak, is, are we allowing people to express themselves politically? Are we opposing cancel culture? And so we're always thinking through that lens. Is this someone's political opinion? Is this somebody's strongly held religious belief? Then they should be able to share and communicate as much as they want. But again, I don't know anywhere in, whether it be the Bible or the Torah or the Quran or any religious text that's out there that gets into, say, slurs or into, say, more personal attacks. I think there's a big difference.
But I suppose some people could interpret strong religious beliefs where, for instance, you say, well, my faith is the only right one and everyone else is condemned to hell. Some people would say that's quite abusive. The Westboro Baptist Church, for instance, would say that anyone who isn't part of their group is condemned to hell, is a sinner. And that would be interpreted as abusive. I mean, my view on groups like that is, as long as they're not infringing on my liberties, as long as they're not physically attacking me, as long as they're not, breaking the law, then they're free to rant and rave and say whatever crazy things they want. But would you say that there is a case that a group as extreme as that, simply by expressing their faith, and I do believe they believe it, is a form of abuse?
Well, again, I think you hit the nail on the head, especially in the U.S., but in most Western cultures. Your free speech rights extend right up to the point where you start to infringe on somebody else's. And so as long as what you're stating, what your beliefs are not invoking some aspect of harm or physical threats or doxing or slurs or something of that nature to somebody, as long as it's not harming them, then you can have your opinion. I might disagree with it. Other people might disagree with it, but that's kind of the whole point. The point of something like Gettr isn't to have a bunch of commonality of political thought. It's about to foster these ideas. And so we're going to have people from the right. We're going to have people from the left. We're going to have people who are on Gettr, on this platform. They're debating back and forth. But you have to have this marketplace of ideas. And I know that's something that's really been trampled on over the past decade, as you referenced just a little bit earlier. But we have to have that digital town square, because it's very clear, especially with Mr. Agrawal taking over at Twitter. They've already started to make their certain moves to become even more restrictive. It's clear that those are no longer free speech platforms. And you can make the case if they ever truly were. But now they've become, they're like Skynet and Terminator, where they've now become fully awakened. And their mission is to go and snuff out anyone who disagrees with them. At Gettr, we have a different approach. We want people from all backgrounds and all persuasions to join our platform. And again, your free speech extends right up to the point where it starts to infringe on somebody else's safety or well-being. And as long as you're not getting to that point, then you should be able to have your free speech. I think
you're absolutely right about that. The trouble is that other groups and social media groups and activist groups have redefined what it means to be safe. and they will say that difference of opinion makes them unsafe, and they will use the language of health and safety to justify deleting accounts. They will say that by making that point, you are erasing our existence. They will use this histrionic language. And a lot of this culture war stuff, from my perspective, is a game of language. It's just wordplay. And actually, we perhaps have to restore what it means to be unsafe. If someone is posting my private home address online and calling for people to come around and attack me, that clearly is a threat to my safety. Someone throwing slurs at me online, which I can just block and ignore, that's not making me unsafe. That's the difference, I think. Do you take into account this idea of psychological harm?
Well, we do, again, going back to the point I said about supporting free speech and opposing cancel culture. And I think that that's the other lens we look through when with these definitions is this simply cancel culture by a different name? And so, yes, you do have some of the, as I affectionately refer to them as the snowflakes or the super sensitive types who would like to cancel any disparate thought that's out there. And so, this really goes to the fact of why you need to have your terms of service, you need to have your policy that's laid out, but you also need to have a community of people who go through and look and are continually revisiting certain things. I'll give you an example. After the terrorist attack outside of the Air Force Base in Kabul, when there were the Americans who were killed, as well, the 13 Americans, as well as I believe there are nearly 200 Afghans who were killed in that terrible bombing. We had a decision to make because there was some video that was posted of effectively real-time deaths that were on video. And we came together and decided that, again, this is a tough decision, that the actual act of somebody taking someone's life is not something that would be permitted on Gettr. But as we show the wreckage and the carnage of what a terrorist attack or other things would look like, that people have to be able to share that and show that to show here is literally what happened. And so we will continually make decisions. We're not going to get it right every single time, but we're going to do our best to maintain, can you express yourself politically? Are you not harming somebody? And again, since we look at it through the lens of support free speech and oppose cancel culture, that is different from, I think, some of the sensitivity Nellies who run around and say, "Oh, you offended me. You must go and remove that."
So given the extent to which Gettr is growing so rapidly, it would suggest that there is a real appetite for this kind of platform where you don't have this paternalism of someone sort of deciding what's best for you to read. And do you think that companies like Twitter, I mean, you mentioned their new policies, that you think it's going to become even more censorial as it goes on. Do you think that, because at the moment, a lot of people fear that the social media, the Silicon Valley oligopoly is sort of now set in place and cannot be disrupted, cannot be changed. Are you confident that we will be able to reopen the marketplace of ideas, that other companies will emerge without being crushed by these companies?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you look at the fact, I think Facebook and Twitter are ultimately dying platforms. And that's not just the hyperbole of it. Look at Facebook's actions, for example. They're changing the name of their company. I mean, it doesn't get much more direct than that. I mean, if you're changing the name of your company, then that's not winning. Mark Zuckerberg recently said that Facebook is going to lose 45% of their teenage users within the next 2 years because it's essentially viewed as being an old person's platform. Twitter continued to see their stock price drop, obviously with Jack Dorsey now stepping aside. I think he was just tired of being the punching bag over and over. They're going to continue to see people leave as the new CEO continues to put in new restrictions. I think that over this past year, our market research has shown that upwards of 20 to 25% of Trump supporters actually left social media after he was deplatformed. They just decided that they didn't want to be a participant in this rigged system, be subject to so much left-wing hate. A lot of those people are now coming off the sidelines. I don't think that all the power should be consolidated just with several big tech oligarchs in Silicon Valley. We need to have a lot more diversity of thought. I think we need more platforms. I think there's room for additional platforms, and that's part of the reason why we're growing so much.
So you are optimistic ultimately that this will happen. I think it's just because of the extent of the power that Silicon Valley seems to wield at the moment that it just feels impossible. However, I mean, you raised a very interesting point about how nakedly partisan they are now. There's no effort at hiding it anymore. And I think really the turning point was obviously deleting President Trump's account, because I think that disturbed a lot of people on the left as well. I think it disturbed a lot of people who don't agree with Trump. You know, he was the sitting president, and this decision was made, and some of the justifications were so lame. You know, when he tweeted out that he wouldn't be attending the inauguration, Twitter claimed that this was a dog whistle to say to his more radical followers, you can go and cause trouble at the inauguration because I won't be there. I mean, that is such a stretch. I mean, certainly Trump's tweets wouldn't come up to the Brandenburg test of incitement to hatred. So I think that might be do you think that moment was really the turning point of Twitter's demise?
Yeah, I think that's a really smart observation. Keep in mind, it wasn't just Twitter. Obviously, Facebook kicked off President Trump. Yeah. Google and YouTube deplatformed him. Obviously, Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, all of the social media accounts, even had the ones who President Trump was never on, whether it be Snapchat or Grindr, things of that nature, came out and said, "Hey, we're not going to allow you on here." Which, hey guys, just let you know, President Trump was never on your platforms in the first place. I always thought that was a little bit kind of funny. But the fact of the matter is that was a big turning point in social media history, because to actually deplatform a sitting president of the United States, that really, at that point, they're operating in completely unbridled territory ever since then. The guardrails are completely gone. In fact, we saw Facebook earlier this year say that they would be ramping up their global, quote unquote, anti-disinformation efforts in advance of elections that are coming up in the Philippines and Brazil and France and Hungary and even the US midterms. Just to be clear on this point, what they're saying is we're going to try to duplicate the same stuff we pulled off to beat President Trump in all these other countries where we're concerned that the candidate or that we don't like, the right of center candidate, might win. And so be very clear, they're not scaling back. I get asked the question all the time, do you think these big tech companies will learn? Will they change? Will they realize their loss of market share, that they're losing people, that the stock price is dropping? Do you think that they'll recognize the error of their ways and come back? I said, no, they're just going to double and triple down, because now they're so beholden to certain woke bases, to their stakeholders within their own environment, that they can't even, they've completely lost sight of what they originally started out to be.
But isn't there a point where they have to respond to the market insofar as, I mean, to give an example, and this is not a social media example, but I think it is comparable, is when Penguin Random House in Canada had staff members revolt because they were publishing Jordan Peterson's new book, and they were crying in the office and saying this is causing harm, actual harm to members of staff. Well, Penguin Random House are in no position to ditch Jordan Peterson, because the publishing house probably wouldn't exist were it not for the sales from his best-selling books. So, at some point, don't they have to accept that they're losing so much money that actually, no, they're going to have to come back to this idea of free speech and basic traditional liberal values?
No, not at all, because they're still making money. Certain of the companies might not be making as much as they'd like, particularly Twitter, which has never truly found a way to monetize and scale in the way that Facebook has. But say for Facebook, for example, they already know that their platform, just the nature of it, is dying. People are moving away from Facebook. It's blocky, it's boring. It effectively at this point is really, they're just a big data company. They don't even really care about making the platform fun and user friendly anymore. I kind of look at Facebook of, here's where I go to see the relatives that I usually don't talk to. That's what Facebook is. What's much more popular, and you even saw this in Zuckerberg's recent investor report, it's everything is going to the short video phase of things. So you look at Instagram. In fact, they said that Instagram Reels generated 60% of the online engagement for their platform. And so even for us, we'll be launching GVision, which will be our marketplace competitor to Instagram Reels, Facebook Stories. That's coming up right at the Chinese New Year, February 1st. There'll be kind of a big celebration. We're going to be introducing our own short video component. And then we're going a place where none of these platforms have gone, where we will be launching Gettr Pay 4th of July of next year, which will be the first ever time that a social media platform has then expanded to become not only a payment system that with Gettr Pay that will rival Apple Pay and Alipay and Samsung Pay and Google Pay, but will have the crypto component, both with their own coins within our own ecosystem. So we're going to a place where Facebook's never been able to get to, where Twitter's never been able to get to, and I think that's because people believe in what our platform is. There's a trust level that's there. They know that we're not just about going in, making money, and driving a left-wing ideology. That we actually will go and fight and defend the right for free speech.
Can I ask you a bit about the relationship between social media and the government? Because I felt that during Trump's presidency, he often made overtures to the idea that he was going to clamp down on the social media companies and the way in which they were violating their free speech obligations. But he never really did anything. And it got to the point towards the end where when they kicked him off the platform, part of me thought, well, you kind of asked for this because you never actually tackled the problem. And let's take, for instance, the Communications Decency Act. Would there not be a case to be made that could be revised in some way? I understand why it's there. I understand that news outlets and online outlets can't be possibly held responsible for everything that is posted, all those comments that are posted underneath. They can't be held responsible if they don't remove a libelous comment, for instance. It would be impossible to moderate it. It's not feasible. And that's what the Section 230 is there to help, to protect. But could it not be modified, reworded, so that it would mean that they wouldn't be held responsible for illegal or libelous content that appears on their site, but nevertheless, they wouldn't therefore be able to use that as a justification to remove things for ideological purposes, just differences of opinion? Could that not be enacted in legislation, or am I being naive?
No, absolutely. In fact, that's something that I've openly called for and said that we have to remove political discrimination from people who use Section 230 as a shield. So I do think the concept of Section 230 of making sure that if you're a platform where people can post various opinions and thoughts, that you shouldn't be held liable or responsible. Obviously, there are always extreme examples. Say, for example, if you allowed a post to stay up indefinitely that was, say that somebody was going to go and commit harm, and that ended up happening, and you left it on despite repeated warnings and notifications. Right. That was happening. I think there are obviously certain cases where it could go to. You should not be able to hide behind Section 230 and practice political discrimination, which that's exactly what Twitter and Facebook and these other guys are doing. And so you're absolutely right. That is the thing where if someone's actively participating in political discrimination, they shouldn't be able to use Section 230 as a shield. So I'm completely on the same page on that. So I'm publicly advocated for, and I will continue to do so. You made another interesting point with regard to President Trump and kind of the coulda, woulda, shoulda, the things that needed to have been done. I'm always asked, as someone who's a senior advisor on his 2020 presidential run, what would you have done different if you had the time machine and go back? And I always tell people I would have made sure that President Trump had his own social media platform developed and launched well in advance of the 2020 race. Yeah. That now I will tell you, I was one of those people who said they will never deplatform or kick off a sitting president of the United States. No way. The media would never, even the haters, the MSDNCs, the fake news CNNs, they would never go and stand. The failing New York Times, they would never allow someone to deplatform a sitting president, no matter what he wrote or what they thought about his opinions. That was wrong. That was naive. Obviously, that's what happened. I wish that we had created a new social media platform in advance of the 2020 election. Two things can be true at the same time here. Twitter and Facebook and some of these companies might have the legal right to go and political discriminate, but they do not. But they don't always necessarily have that right if we change 230 and they want to hide behind that. And so if they want to become a publisher, i.e. the New York Times or the Washington Post, where they're held accountable for every word that appears on their pages, they can certainly do that. They can be as politically discriminating as they want to be. But if they want to be a platform, then we need to change 230 so they can't discriminate politically.
Do you think that Trump will run again? And if he does, do you think he will be dependent on platforms such as yours in order to get his message out there?
So ultimately, yes and yes. I do think President Trump runs again in 2024. I do think that what we saw in 2020 was essentially what we didn't see. I think there were a lot of looking around corners and forecasting for how the rules of the game would be changed mid-game to try to impede his advances or impede his success. I think President Trump will be much more ready in the next campaign. And I think he will need platforms such as Gettr if he's going to be able to get his message out and bypass the traditional media, because right now he does not have that social media channel.
But of course, if he were to go on to Gettr in advance of the next election, people would then say, oh, well, that's Trump's platform. And people would inevitably try to paint you as a fully partisan platform. I noticed on Wikipedia, I think it describes Gettr as a conservative platform. But you've said that you're open to having left-wing accounts on there. Are you worried about this, or how would you deal with this situation?
Yeah, we deal with it when we deal with it. Obviously, I'd love to have President Trump on the platform, and I've told him that. I've reserved his @RealDonaldTrump handle for him, and we even talked about it again a couple of weeks ago, even after he's made his own news. And I told him that he's always welcome here. While he's waiting for his platform to be built or constructed, which I think it's going to take a while for that to be done. He's welcome to join our platform, then go to his platform, for example, when that's up and running. But this is always going to be a platform for people to express themselves politically. Look, I would love to have Crooked Hillary join the platform. I'd love to have where's Hunter? Now, do I think they're going to right away? Probably not. But we have reserved the accounts for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi, AOC, Bernie Sanders. We'd love to have them join the platform. That's always going to be their ability. And even as we look around globally, for example, I'd love to have President Macron join the platform. I'd love to have in France, I'd have Lula join the platform. In Brazil, will they right away? Probably not. But again, we want to make sure that that's being offered to them and they know that they can join.
Can I ask you about your involvement with the Trump campaign, and how did you get involved with that, and what was that experience like for you?
Yeah. So initially I became involved. I'd worked for Mayor Rudy Giuliani on his unsuccessful presidential run in 2008, at which point I became introduced to a lot of folks in New York and a lot of different people in circles that overlapped with the Trump orbit. I'd actually talked with President Trump in 2011 as he was thinking about running for president against Barack Obama in his first reelection in 2012. And if President Trump had run in 2012, then I was going to be his campaign manager. Ended up, I kind of left that experience thinking he wouldn't run. I kind of thought maybe it's just some talk and conjecture to juice up his apprentice contract. And so I signed up with Ted Cruz for the 2016 race, and then President Trump did run, and he did win. And then after Trump beat Cruz, Indiana was essentially our Alamo for the Cruz campaign. Then Jared Kushner called me about a month or 6 weeks after and said, we want to get you on board. I know we had a good talk 4 years ago when his father-in-law was thinking about running. And so Jared and I have a lot of mutual friends, and so he brought me onto the team.
And what was that experience like, though? Because I mean, I can imagine it must have been quite fascinating to be involved in this campaign. Did you see where it was going ultimately? I mean, I could see very clearly that Biden's campaign appeared to be to stay in the shadows as much as possible and not to expose himself to media scrutiny. Did you get a sense that the outcome was going to be what it ended up being?
So 2016 and 2020 were completely different races. In the 2016, I knew once we got into the summer there that President Trump would ultimately be the winner against Hillary Clinton, because she could never get above that 44-45% threshold. And that people wanted change. They saw her as being the wrong direction. If we could just steady the ship enough with President Trump that he could pull off the win, which we did. And but I'd say that I learned a lot of things, both from someone who had a longer background in communications and marketing. I really learned a lot of new things from President Trump. A lot of it is about being concise and tight with your message, about being very punchy, about not being afraid to be a little bit daring or even sometimes borderline offensive to get your point across. And a lot of things I've been able to take into the corporate side as well, because people are bombarded with so many images and so many different thoughts and things of that nature that if you can't punch through, if you can't stand out, then you're never going to be recognized. For example, we will sometimes fly plane banners above football games and things like that. And at first it started off with the Twitter sucks, join Gettr. Rather catchy, gets people attention and helps raise the name idea. And then we moved into Let's Go Brandon, join Gettr, where we got a lot of play and attention here in the US. And by the way, the plane banners are cheap. They're like $2,500 to go and fly around for a couple hours, and you get tens of thousands of eyeballs that are on them. So doing different things that are creative, I learned a lot of that. 2020 was different. 2020 was Obviously, we had the election rules being changed. I came back into the team, so I stepped away for almost 4 years. I was still in regular contact with the president, active with his team, and a frequent visitor at the White House and such, but I wasn't formally back inside the campaign. But I came back right after the killing of George Floyd, and you saw this convergence of not just the fact the election rules are being changed. You had COVID, you had the George Floyd killing, which then moved into the Black Lives Matter protests. Things were going on, and so really it was the kind of the worst of all possible dynamics. It wasn't just the perfect storm, where you had as we saw from the Mark Wahlberg movie. I mean, this was 4 different storms that were converging at one place. I still believe that if the voting rules had not been unconstitutionally changed, that President Trump would have been the winner. Obviously, we're only talking 44,000 votes over 3 states. I do believe there was significant fraud and irregularities on election day, and then the actual voting. I don't think there were enough specific fraud and irregularities in the actual voting to have overturned it on its own. But when you take a look at the unconstitutional changes, and just for folks in the UK who might not understand that, in our Constitution, it very clearly says the state legislatures need to be the ones who set up the voting systems for each state. What we saw in the U.S. in the run-up to 2020 were a number of blue state Democratic, whether it be governors or county executives, mayors, things of that nature, go and change voting rules to essentially send out ballots to people even if they hadn't requested them or if they didn't have the proper paperwork on file. And I do think that juiced the numbers enough to where that delivered the win. As we saw from the Wisconsin State Supreme Court decision, the 4-3 decision that we lost, however, it made pretty clear that, yes, while President Trump was right in the merits of saying that these changes were made in an unconstitutional fashion, that no court in the land was going to go and overturn an election or discount votes that people believed they were casting legally. That's just not a means of redress that any of the courts were ever going to grant. And so that's a little bit longer an explanation than maybe you were looking for, but I think that as we go into 2024, we'll be much more ready.
No, I think it's important to outline those reasons because it's one of the main issues. I think everyone accepts, and even I'm sure the Democrats would accept, that there's always a degree of voter fraud when you have postal votes in any election. I don't think anyone would deny that. I think the question of whether it's enough to tip the balance is the bigger question. I mean, you've just acknowledged there that you don't think voter fraud alone is sufficient to have tipped the balance. I suppose what I would say is there's the question of strategy. There's the question of rhetoric. I mean, President Trump was on GBNews the other night, and he was again using the phrase "rigged." The election was rigged. After the election, and we had the build up to the Capitol riots, where he was making similar claims and saying he won the election. This, I fear, when it comes across to the public, it sounds like a sore loser. I don't think strategically it is a good idea to keep going on about things being rigged. And that in itself, I think, could be one of the major reasons why he wouldn't win next time, because he seems to be re-emphasizing this. Do you not think there's a point to that?
Certain points of that, I agree with you. Certain points I might push back a little bit. Look, I've told President Trump that I think that he needs to talk much more about the future as opposed to 2020. I do think the election rules were rigged, as I outlined on the state by state, how they circumvented the legislatures and had partisan actors go and change the rules to try to goose effectively what the outcomes were going to be. I do think that system was rigged, and it was during the game. The same thing you get to halftime of a football game, and then they decide that the other team gets more free kicks than the other side from a penalty, or at the end of the game in a tiebreaker situation. One side gets 5 kicks, the other side gets 3, or something of that nature. You can't go and change rules like that in the middle of the game. You can't change it at halftime. It has to be something that's clearly done. There's systems and procedures in that. So I do think that it was rigged, but I also don't think that President Trump should talk about it as much as he does. I think that more of the future-looking vision, I think highlighting particularly where Joe Biden has caused these crises, whether it be on the southern border, whether it be on failure to stand up to China, whether it be that's flying over Taiwan on a daily basis, or the 9-dash line now extending effectively to Honolulu. And there's really there are no checks on China. But you look at the fact that Afghanistan withdrawal was disaster. Many of the reforms that brought about by the Abraham Accords have been torn up because Hamas no longer is worried that the U.S. will come in and smack them or defend Israel. Their right to do so. We see the hyperinflation crisis. We see the gas price crisis. All these things. This is just Joe Biden's first year. I mean, think what the guy's going to do in his next 3 years. Biden does not look well. He's bumbling. He's stumbling. He's barely coherent. Kamala Harris is so bad that her poll ratings are even worse than Joe Biden's. That's why I think when President Trump runs in 2024, it won't be against Joe Biden or even Kamala Harris. I think it's probably going to be against someone like a Gavin Newsom.
That's very interesting. But I think to focus on Biden's failings is, that's my view, is that it's the more strategic approach. And it seems that you share that view. But when it comes to Biden, I think I agree as well. I can't see a scenario where Biden would be running again. But do you think that given the way that the media have been treating Biden with kid gloves, I mean, we saw with Afghanistan, that was the first time, I think, where he was subject to any kind of serious media scrutiny, where he had to answer difficult questions. I hadn't seen any evidence of that happening before. It's as though the media were, on the whole, giving him a very, very easy ride. And you do seem to have that problem in America with the broadcast media in particular, is that they are so politically skewed one way. Doesn't that make it, as with the social media issue, with the social media tech giants, does that make it almost impossible under those circumstances for a Republican candidate to triumph?
No, not at all. It definitely makes it more challenging. We've always known that it's not a completely fair game, but it's at least having the rules in place to understand. We know we're not going to get all the calls from the referees, but there's a difference, between the structural changes. I think part of this is the need for social media platforms such as Gettr. The reason why you have to have these additional means of communication. You take a look at Brazil, where President Bolsonaro has the media stacked against him. You need to have social media platforms, a way to communicate directly to people. Obviously, that's something that Nigel Farage used very effectively in the Brexit campaign, but something around the world. I do think that social media, even though the last couple of years it's really been hijacked by the left, I think social media ultimately can be a force for good. I mean, take a look at Gettr's logo, for example. Our torch that we have literally represents bringing light, bringing democracy to places where it doesn't exist. And that's what we think, whether it's taking down the CCP or bringing free thought and free expression into totalitarian regimes around the world. We want to have people in control of their own speech, have people in control of their own expression, of their own destiny, ultimately in control of their own money for what they're going to be doing here. And so it's very much a freedom-loving concept. And I think social media can be a force of good to help do that. I think it's just gotten off track the last few years by some of these greedy Silicon Valley guys who decided to shift into world framing.
Do you think, given the institutional capture of what we call the woke movement in all areas of life, in terms of media, in terms of academia, in terms of political and cultural institutions, do you think that given that situation that we currently find ourselves in, and given that this movement is so hostile to the principle of free speech, do you think that we are winning the free speech argument at the moment?
I think that we're turning it around at the moment. I would not say that we're winning, but I think the bloom is coming off the rose, so to speak, with regard to this woke movement and a lot of the counterculture and what we've seen over the last couple of years, where it's just cancel everybody, wipe everybody out. They have to be eliminated. This person must be banished from society. I think we're now starting to come out of that fog, so to speak. We're not there yet, but I think we're definitely in the process of turning it around. And I see Gettr being at the tip of the spear of that.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Jason. If you just want to remind everyone where they can sign up for Gettr or reach you.
Absolutely. So you can go to Gettr.com. You can go to the Apple Store, Gettr, Gettr. Go to the Google Play Store, Gettr. Real simple, pull up. It is easy to create the account. A couple other really cool things. If you're worried about losing any of your intellectual property from Twitter, for example, you can actually import in all of your tweets in your Gettr timeline, which is very cool. So that all comes with you. That's your property. If you go and look at your terms of service for the other companies, they will tell you that they will make clear they don't actually own what you post, because then they'd be a publisher. And so that intellectual property come with you. We're going to do the same thing with Instagram posts, being able to import those in when we launch our short video series. So GVision coming up here right around February 1. That's going to be cool. And so Gettr, again, if you support free speech, oppose cancel culture, come and give us a try.
Thank you for joining me for the Free Speech Nation podcast with my guest, Jason Miller. Please do check out Gettr.com and see what he's up to. If you enjoyed the show, please do like and subscribe and the rest of it. And I'm going to see you in the new year. We're going to take a short break over the next few weeks, but we will be back with some more fabulous guests. See you then.